When Paul Jobs left the Coast Guard after World War II, he made a bet with his crewmates. They had arrived in San Francisco, where their ship was taken out of service, and Paul bet he would find a wife within 2 weeks. Paul was a fit, tattooed engine mechanic, 6 feet tall, and looked a bit like James Dean. However, it wasn't his looks that got him a date with Clara Hagopian, the kind daughter of Armenian immigrants. It was the fact that he and his friends had a car, unlike the group Clara had originally planned to go out with that evening. 10 days later, in March 1946, Paul got engaged to Clara and won his bet. Their marriage was a happy one that lasted more than 40 years until they were parted by death. Paul Reinhold Jobs grew up on a dairy farm in Germantown, Wisconsin. Despite having an alcoholic and sometimes abusive father, Paul developed a gentle and calm nature. After dropping out of high school, he traveled through the Midwest working as a mechanic until, at age 19, he joined the Coast Guard, even though he didn't know how to swim. He served on the USS General M.C. Meigs, spending much of the war transporting troops to Italy for General Patton. His skills as a machinist and fireman earned him commendations, but he occasionally got into minor trouble and never advanced beyond the rank of seaman. Clara was born in New Jersey, where her parents had settled after fleeing the Turks in Armenia. When she was a child, they moved to the Mission District of San Francisco. Clara had a secret she rarely talked about. She had been married before, but her husband was killed in the war. So when she met Paul Jobs on their first date, she was ready to start a new life. Like many people who lived through the war, Clara and Paul had experienced enough excitement and wanted to settle down, raise a family, and live a quieter life. They had little money, so they moved to Wisconsin and lived with Paul's parents for a few years. Then they moved to Indiana, where Paul got a job as a machinist for International Harvester. Paul loved tinkering with old cars and made extra money buying, restoring, and selling them. Eventually, he quit his job to become a full-time used car salesman. Clara, however, loved San Francisco and convinced Paul to move back there in 1952. They got an apartment in the Sunset District, facing the Pacific, just south of Golden Gate Park. Paul took a job working for a finance company as a repo man, picking the locks of cars whose owners hadn't paid their loans and repossessing them. He also bought, repaired, and sold some of these cars, making a decent living. However, something was missing in their lives. They wanted children, but Clara had suffered an ectopic pregnancy, where the fertilized egg implanted in a fallopian tube instead of the uterus, and she couldn't have any children. By 1955, after 9 years of marriage, they were looking to adopt a child. Like Paul Jobs, Joanne Schiebel came from a rural Wisconsin family with German heritage. Her father, Arthur Schiebel, had moved to the outskirts of Green Bay, where he and his wife owned a mink farm and successfully dabbled in other businesses, including real estate and photo engraving. He was very strict, especially about his daughter's relationships, and strongly disapproved of her first love, an artist who wasn't Catholic. So, it was no surprise that he threatened to cut Joanne off completely when she, a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, fell in love with Abdel Fattah John Jandali, a Muslim teaching assistant from Syria. Jandali was the youngest of 9 children in a prominent Syrian family. His father owned oil refineries and various other businesses, with significant holdings in Damascus and Homs, and at one point, he largely controlled the price of wheat in the region. His mother was a traditional Muslim woman who was a conservative, obedient housewife. Both the Schiebel and Jandali families valued education highly. Abdel Fattah attended a Jesuit boarding school, even though he was Muslim, and earned an undergraduate degree at the American University in Beirut before pursuing a doctoral degree in political science at the University of Wisconsin. In the summer of 1954, Joanne went to Syria with Abdel Fattah. They spent 2 months in Homs, where she learned to cook Syrian dishes from his family. When they returned to Wisconsin, she discovered she was pregnant. Both were 23 but decided not to marry because her father, who was dying, had threatened to disown her if she married Abdel Fattah. Abortion was not an easy option in their small Catholic community. So, in early 1955, Joanne traveled to San Francisco. There, a kindly doctor who helped unwed mothers took care of her, delivered their babies, and arranged closed adoptions. Joanne had one requirement: her child must be adopted by college graduates. The doctor arranged for the baby to be placed with a lawyer and his wife. But when a boy was born on February 24, 1955, the couple decided they wanted a girl and backed out. The boy was then adopted by a high school dropout with a passion for mechanics and his hard-working wife, who was a bookkeeper. Paul and Clara named their new baby Stephen Paul Jobs. When Joanne found out that her baby had been placed with a couple who had not graduated from high school, she refused to sign the adoption papers. This standoff lasted for weeks, even after the baby had settled into the Jobs household. Joanne eventually relented, but only after the couple promised, indeed signed a pledge, to fund a savings account for the boy's college education. Another reason Joanne hesitated to sign the adoption papers was that her father was about to die, and she planned to marry Jandali soon after. She hoped, as she later told family members with tears in her eyes, that once they were married, she could get their baby boy back. Arthur Schiebel died in August 1955, after the adoption was finalized. Just after Christmas that year, Joanne and Abdul Fattah married in St. Philip the Apostle Catholic Church in Green Bay. He got his PhD in international politics the next year, and they had another child, a girl named Mona. After she and Jandali divorced in 1962, Joanne lived a dreamy and peripatetic life, which her daughter, the acclaimed novelist Mona Simpson, would capture in her book Anywhere But Here. Because Steve's adoption had been closed, it would be 20 years before they all found each other. Steve Jobs knew from an early age that he was adopted. My parents were very open with me about that, he recalled. He vividly remembered sitting on the lawn of his house, at age 6 or 7, telling the girl who lived across the street. "So does that mean your real parents didn't want you?" the girl asked. "Lightning bolts went off in my head," Jobs remembered. "I ran into the house, crying. My parents said, 'No, you have to understand.'
They were very serious and looked me straight in the eye. They said, 'We specifically picked you out.' Both of my parents said that and repeated it slowly for me. They emphasized every word in that sentence. Abandoned. Chosen. Special. Those concepts became part of who Jobs was and how he saw himself. His closest friends believed that knowing he was given up at birth left some scars. I think his desire for complete control of whatever he makes comes directly from his personality and the fact that he was abandoned at birth, said one longtime colleague, Del Yocam. He wants to control his environment and sees the product as an extension of himself. Greg Calhoun, who became close to Jobs right after college, saw another effect. "Steve talked to me a lot about being abandoned and the pain that caused," he said. "It made him independent. He followed the beat of a different drummer, and that came from being in a different world than he was born into."